She always knew. That is the sentence that appeared in a small Port Arthur newspaper sometime in the early 1970s, after Janis Joplin had become famous enough that local publications felt the particular obligation that local publications feel when someone who grew up in their circulation area has become something the world cares about. The article gathered the memories of people who had known Janis before she was Janis, before Port Arthur became the town she had escaped rather than simply the town she was from. Most of the people interviewed said what people in these situations tend to say, that they had always seen something in her, that they had known she was special, that Port Arthur had recognized what it had even if it hadn't always known how to show it. These statements were not entirely false. They were the statements of people trying to position themselves retrospectively on the right side of a history that had already been written, people who understood, now that the distance was clear, that what they had witnessed in real time had been significant, and who were doing the very human thing of reconstructing their memories to reflect that understanding. And then there was a single sentence from a woman who had been an English teacher at Thomas Jefferson High School during the years when Janis Joplin was a student there. Her name was not prominently featured in the article. She was one voice among several, but what she said was different from what everyone else said, different in the way that honest things are different from the things that sound like they should be said. She said, "I always knew, I just didn't know how to say so." The distinction contained in that sentence, the distance between knowing and saying, between seeing and speaking, is the story this piece is about. It is about a woman whose name history has largely not preserved, who taught English in a Texas high school in the late 1950s and early 1960s, who read Janis Joplin's compositions before the rest of the world heard her voice, who understood with the specific understanding of someone whose job is to recognize what language can do and who does it, that the student in the third row with the paint-stained jacket and the too loud laugh was carrying something real, and who, when the moment came that most required her to say so, said nothing. This is not a simple story about failure. It is a more complicated story about the distance between private recognition and public declaration, and about what that distance costs, not just the person who is seen and not spoken for, but the person who does. The seeing and finds that the knowing and the saying do not reach each other in time. Thomas Jefferson High School in Port Arthur, Texas, in the late 1950s was an institution with a clear sense of its own purpose. It existed to prepare students for the version of adult life that Port Arthur offered and expected: the oil refinery economy, the family structures, the social arrangements of a Gulf Coast Texas town shaped by specific industries and specific expectations. The school was not oppressive in any dramatic sense. It was simply shaped, the way all institutions are shaped, by the assumptions of the world that built it. The English department was part of this. Literature was taught as a body of received wisdom. Writing was taught as a set of forms, the essay with its introduction and body and conclusion, the paragraph with its topic, sentence, and supporting details, the sentence with its proper grammar. These were not illegitimate things to teach. They were the tools that students needed to function in the world the school was preparing them for. But the teacher who taught Janis Joplin in those years had been drawn to English not by the forms, but by what the forms could occasionally contain. She had studied literature in college with the genuine passion of someone who understood that words, arranged in certain ways, could do something that nothing else could do. She had become a teacher with a genuine desire to transmit not just the mechanics of reading and writing, but the understanding of why the mechanics mattered, what they were in service of, what could come through them when they were used with intention and honesty. She had been teaching for 10 years when Janis Joplin arrived in her class. She had developed the particular calibration that experienced teachers develop, the ability to assess quickly and accurately where each student was and what they needed, to see through the surface of a paper to the quality of mind underneath. And she could see, within the first month of having Janis Joplin in her class, that she was looking at something she had not encountered before. The compositions were the first evidence. Composition assignments in an English class in a Texas high school in the late 1950s were specific and bounded. Write about your summer, describe a place you have visited, explain the importance of a historical event. The forms were familiar, the expectations were clear, and most students wrote within those forms and met those expectations with varying degrees of competence and enthusiasm. Janis wrote differently, not in ways that broke them. Formal requirements, she understood them well enough to meet them while doing something else inside them. But the quality of what appeared on the page was unlike what appeared on anyone else's page. It was specific where other students were general. It was honest where other students were careful. It had a quality of having been actually thought rather than assembled from the parts that the student knew were expected. The teacher read these compositions the way she read all compositions, at her desk in the evening with a red pen, and she found herself stopping, rereading, sitting with sentences in a way she did not sit with other students' sentences. Not because the sentences were technically perfect, they sometimes weren't, but because they were doing something. They were using language the way language was supposed to be used, the way she had understood it could be used since she was herself a student reading for the first time something that made her understand why reading was worth the time it took. She did something that teachers do when they encounter a student whose work exceeds the ordinary. She read passages from Janis's compositions aloud to the class, not always identifying the author, sometimes simply presenting a particularly strong piece of writing as an example of what the assignment could produce when executed well. She gave Janis her highest marks. She wrote comments in the margins that went beyond the usual corrections into genuine engagement with what Janis was doing. These things mattered to Janis. The people who knew her in those years consistently note that she craved recognition in the way that people crave it when it has been withheld, urgently, hungrily, with a need that was out of proportion to the ordinary adolescent need for approval, because it had been so consistently denied in the other areas of her school life. The teacher who read her work aloud and wrote real comments in the margins was giving her something she was not getting elsewhere in the building. The classroom was one of the few places in Thomas Jefferson High School where what Janis produced was recognized as good rather than what Janis was being marked as wrong. She noticed. She responded. The compositions she wrote for that class became one of the things she was most invested in producing well, not because she wanted to please the teacher, though she did, but because the teacher had established that the classroom was a space where honest writing was recognized and valued, and Janis was someone who needed a space where what was honest about her was recognized and valued. But there was something the teacher could see from her desk that she did not fully address in the classroom, something about the compositions that went beyond their quality, something about the person producing them, the specific nature of what Janis was carrying that suggested a situation that extended beyond the question of whether the essays were good. The compositions were good. They were also in certain ways cries, not dramatic, not explicit. But the specific quality of what she wrote, the way she wrote about loneliness and about not belonging and about the distance between how she experienced the world and how the world seemed to expect her to experience it, these things were visible in the writing to someone trained to read what language was actually doing underneath what it appeared to be doing. The teacher saw it. She did not know then what to do with what she saw. The vote happened in 1960. Janis was 17. The specifics are well enough documented in the various accounts of Janis Joplin's high school years. The students of Thomas Jefferson High School voted on superlatives for the school paper, and someone nominated Janis Joplin for Ugliest Man on campus, and the vote went through, and the result was published. The teacher learned about it. She learned about it the way that teachers learn about things that happen among students, not always immediately, not always completely, but eventually, and in this case with enough specificity to understand what had occurred and what it meant for the student who had been its target. She did not address it publicly. This is the center of the story, not the nomination, not the vote. These were the actions of students and the machinery of adolescent cruelty has its own logic that is not entirely the responsibility of the adults around it. The center of the story is the teacher's silence, the decision, conscious or not, considered or reflexive, to not say, in the classroom that had become one of the few spaces where Janis's work was recognized, something that might have altered the balance, something that acknowledged what had happened. Something that used the authority of the position to say, the thing that was done here is wrong, and this person in your midst is not what the vote said she was. The reasons for the silence are not entirely clear. They never are when silence is chosen over speech at a critical moment. The teacher was a professional in an institution with its own social arrangements and its own implicit rules about what teachers said and didn't say. The incident with the Superlative was social rather than academic. It happened outside her classroom, produced by dynamics that predated her class and would outlast it. The reasonable professional response was to attend to what happened in the classroom and leave what happened in the school's social life to others. These are real reasons. They are also not adequate, which is the thing that the teacher understood, did not understand in time, but understood eventually and carried. Because Janis Joplin knew the teacher had seen her compositions, she knew that one person in that building had read what she wrote and recognized it as real. And the silence of that person in the aftermath of the vote had a particular weight that the silence of people who had never recognized her did not have. The silence of people who have not seen you is simply absence. The silence of people who have seen you is a choice. Janis left Port Arthur. She did what she had known with the certainty that people who have no alternative come to know things that she was going to do. She went to Austin, then San Francisco, then back to Texas, then back to San Francisco again. She built the career that the world eventually found through Big Brother and the holding company, through Monterey, through Cheap Thrills and Pearl. She built it out of the voice and the need and the specific urgency of someone for whom performing was not a career choice but an existential requirement. The teacher stayed in Port Arthur. She continued teaching at Thomas Jefferson High School for years after Janis graduated. She was, by all accounts, a good teacher throughout her career. She watched Janis's career from the distance of Port Arthur. She heard the records. She read the reviews. She watched Janis go back to Port Arthur in 1969, the famous return, the feathers and beads, the interview in which Janis said she had come back to show them what they had passed up, and she understood with the understanding of someone who had been in a specific position to see what was being passed up, the full weight of that statement. And then in 1970, Janis Joplin died, and a newspaper came to ask people in Port Arthur what they remembered. The teacher said, "I always knew, I just didn't know how to say so." It was the most honest sentence in the article. It was also the sentence that carried the most weight for the person who said it, the specific weight of a recognition that had arrived too late to do the work that recognition is actually for. The function of being seen, genuinely and clearly and without qualification, is not merely emotional. For certain people in certain circumstances, being seen clearly by someone with the authority to make that seeing consequential is the difference between a life that stays small and a life that finds a way to be what it was always trying to be. Janis Joplin found her way. She found it through the music and through the city and through the years of building a voice in public. She found it despite Port Arthur rather than because of it, or that is one way of telling it, the way she sometimes told it herself. But there is another way of telling it, which is that she found her way partly because of the teacher, too, because there was a space for some portion of those Thomas Jefferson High School years where what Janis wrote was read carefully and responded to as real, where someone with the authority of the position said, through the comments and the marks and the reading aloud, "This is good, this is what good looks like." The fact of that recognition, partial, insufficient, not extended when it was most needed, was still a fact. Still something that existed, still, for a girl who was receiving almost nothing in the way of genuine recognition from her environment, something that mattered. The teacher knew this. She knew it from the distance of the years, from the understanding that arrives when you have had long enough to see what happened and what your role in it was. She knew that what she had given was not enough and that it had still been something, and she knew that the something had carried a cost that she had not been willing to pay when it was most required. She carried that knowledge for the rest of her career. Not as guilt exactly, or not only as guilt, but as a presence, a permanent member of the accounting that any person of conscience does over the course of a long life. She said, "I always knew, I just didn't know how to say so." What she meant in the fullness of those words was, "I saw you. I saw what you were carrying and I saw what you could do with it, and I understood that someone with my position should have said so, and I did not say so, and I have not stopped knowing that I did not say so." Janis Joplin has been gone for more than 50 years. The teacher has been gone for decades. The specific conversation that should have happened between them in a classroom in Port Arthur, in the years when it would have made a difference, never happened. What happened instead was the compositions, read aloud to a class that did not fully understand what it was hearing, the marks in the margins, the silence. After the vote, the years of watching from Port Arthur as the girl who had sat in the third period class became something the world understood as important. And the sentence, published in a local newspaper in the early 1970s, that said more in its brevity than anything else in the article. The story of Janis Joplin is usually told as the story of the voice. The voice is real, and the story is right to center on it. But underneath the voice was the thing that the teacher saw in the compositions, the thing that had been there from the beginning, a person using language to say something real about what it felt like to be alive in the specific way she was alive, in the specific place that had been given to her. The teacher saw it. She did not say so fully. She spent the rest of her life knowing she had not said so fully, and the girl who had needed her to say so went on to spend her career saying it herself, from stages, through microphones, to rooms full of people who were hungry for exactly the kind of honesty that Port Arthur had not known how to hold. The teacher finally said it, in a local newspaper, in the early 1970s, after it was too late to matter in the way it would have mattered, but the saying was real, and the knowing was real. And what Janis made from the knowing, from the years of carrying it and eventually giving it away, note by note, to anyone who was willing to receive it, that was the most real thing of all. It is still real. It is still playing. It is still saying, I see you. You are real. What you are carrying is real. Someone always knew. It just took some of them longer to say so.